There are certain moments in a person's life when silence finally breaks. When everything that was whispered behind closed doors, everything that was speculated about in magazine columns and late-night talk shows, everything that polite society agreed not to ask directly, suddenly comes pouring out into the open air. For Shania Twain, that moment came at 60. And when she finally spoke, the world stopped to listen. Because this wasn't just a celebrity telling her story. This was a woman who had carried decades of secrets, survival, betrayal, illness, and rebirth all at once, and had somehow kept smiling through every single one of them. The fans who had loved her since the mid-90s always sensed there was something more beneath the surface. Something behind those eyes that sparkled under stadium lights, but seemed to hold a weight that no number of sequined outfits could cover. They were right. There was far more to Shania Twain than anyone had ever been allowed to see. And now, finally, she was ready to show it all. To understand why her recent revelations hit so hard, you have to go back to the very beginning. Not to Nashville, not to the Grammy stage, not even to the early bar performances that built her reputation. You have to go back to a small, freezing coal mining town in northern Ontario, Canada, where a little girl named Eileen Regina Edwards was growing up in a house that rarely had enough heat, enough food, or enough safety. That girl would one day become one of the best-selling female artists in the history of recorded music. But first, she would have to survive a childhood that most people would struggle to even imagine. She was born in Windsor, Ontario in 1965, the second of 3 daughters to her mother Sharon. When her parents divorced before she was even old enough to form memories, Sharon eventually remarried a man of Ojibwe heritage named Jerry Twain, who adopted Eileen and her sisters, giving them his last name. The family relocated to Timmins, a remote community deep in the Canadian North, where winters were brutal and opportunities were scarce. Jerry worked when he could find work, and Sharon pushed her daughter toward music with a kind of desperate intensity that only made sense later when you understood how little else there was to hold on to. By the time she was 3 years old, she was already singing around the house with a voice that turned heads. By 4, she was picking out simple melodies on a small guitar. By 5, she had won her first talent competition, walking away with a ribbon and $5 that her family genuinely needed. These were not the charming early memories of a child prodigy being nurtured in a warm, supportive home. These were the early chapters of a survival story. Music was not a hobby for young Eileen. It was a lifeline for her and for everyone who depended on her. What she has now confirmed, and what her closest followers always suspected, is that those early years were marked by violence and fear that no child should ever know. Jerry Twain had a temper that erupted without warning, and Sharon bore the worst of it. There were nights when the children witnessed things that permanently altered how they understood the world. There were moments of danger so acute that young Eileen had to intervene physically to protect her mother. At 10 years old, after witnessing a particularly savage assault, she struck her stepfather with a chair to make him stop. He hit her back. She was 10 years old. And then the abuse became something even darker. What she has confirmed in recent years, and spoken about with a quiet, devastating honesty, is that Jerry's violence eventually extended into sexual abuse. She developed ways of trying to make herself invisible, wearing extra layers of clothing, trying to hide the body that was changing as she grew older. She performed in bars late at night, sometimes past midnight, because the money she earned kept the electricity running and food on the table. Men in those audiences were often drunk. Some of them reached for her. She was a child. She kept going anyway, because stopping was not an option. She has said in interviews that the music itself was both an escape and a cage during those years. She loved singing more than she could put into words, but the circumstances under which she was forced to do it so young, in those environments, for those reasons, left marks that she would spend the rest of her life working through. When she finally spoke openly about the sexual abuse at the hands of her stepfather, she was not doing so for shock value or sympathy. She was doing it because she wanted other survivors to know that it was possible to carry that weight and still build something extraordinary. That the abuse did not define her. That she had never let it. The small town of Timmins had no idea it was watching a future superstar struggle through her formative years. To those around her, she was simply a hard-working, talented girl with a mother who pushed her relentlessly and a home life that nobody asked too many questions about. She sang in churches, at community events, on local radio, and in bars that should never have allowed a child inside. She was writing her own songs by the age of 10, lyrics that processed grief and longing that most adults never encounter. One of those early songs was written about her mother's depression, about the days when Sharon would not get out of bed and Eileen would take care of the younger children, cook what little food there was, and try to keep the household from falling completely apart. Then, in November of 1987, everything changed in an instant. Shania, who was 22 at the time, received a phone call that shattered the world she had built around herself. Sharon and Jerry had been killed in a head-on collision with a logging truck. Despite everything Jerry had done to her and to her mother, the loss was catastrophic. Whatever complicated feelings she had about him, her mother was gone. The woman who had driven her hundreds of miles to sing at talent shows, who had believed in her voice before anyone else did, who had also put her in dangerous situations and failed to fully protect her, was gone. Instantly, without warning. And then came the responsibility. She had 3 younger siblings who needed a parent. So at 22, still grieving, still processing a childhood full of trauma, she became one. She set aside her music ambitions and took a job at a resort in Huntsville, Ontario, where she performed nightly in stage shows to pay the bills and keep her brothers and sister fed, clothed, and in school. For 5 years, she put her dreams on hold. People who know her story understand that this period of her life, often overlooked in favor of the more glamorous chapters that followed, reveals perhaps the most essential truth about who she is. She did not chase fame. She earned survival first, and fame came later, on her own terms. When she finally made her way to Nashville in the early 90s, she arrived not as a wide-eyed hopeful, but as a woman who had already been tested in ways that most recording industry executives would never comprehend. She changed her name to Shania, a word she understood to mean, "I'm on my way" in Ojibwe, and she used her stepfather's surname as a tribute to the man who had adopted her, complicated as that legacy was. She knocked on doors. She cleaned houses to pay for singing lessons. She slept where she could. Her first album, released in 1993, did not set the world on fire, but it put her in front of the right people at the right moment. One of those people was Robert John Mutt Lange, one of the most successful record producers alive, a man whose credits included some of the biggest rock albums ever made. He called her out of nowhere after hearing her music, and within months they were not only creative partners, but deeply romantically involved. They married in December of 1993, just 6 months after they first spoke. He was 17 years older than her. Their connection was intense, creative, and for a long time, genuinely loving. Together, they built something that the music industry had never quite seen before. The album they made together, released in 1995, and called The Woman in Me, rewrote the rules of country music. It sold more than 20 million copies worldwide. It earned her a Grammy. It made her a household name. But what almost nobody knew at the time was that she was already beginning to feel the early symptoms of a disease that had entered her body through a single tick bite sometime around 1993. Lyme disease is insidious in the way it hides, mimicking other conditions, causing symptoms that doctors frequently misattribute to stress or anxiety. Her voice, the most precious instrument she possessed, began showing subtle signs of damage. She felt weak. She felt foggy. She kept going because stopping had never been something she was built for. The album that followed, Come On Over, released in late 1997, became the best-selling album ever recorded by a female artist. It has sold over 40 million copies. The songs from that album became the soundtrack of an era. She toured the world, performed for millions, and stood at the absolute pinnacle of the music industry. From the outside, the picture was perfect. A gifted woman who had risen from poverty and hardship to achieve everything the world had to offer, standing beside her husband and creative partner, raising their son Aja, who was born in 2001, in a beautiful life in Switzerland. But she has now confirmed what the rumors always suggested. The picture was not perfect. It was in many ways coming apart from inside. The Lyme disease was progressing. Her vocal cords were sustaining nerve damage that doctors had not yet identified or explained. There were long stretches during which she could not understand why her voice was doing things it had never done before, why her body felt unreliable in ways that frightened her. And the marriage, for all its creative electricity, had its own fractures. She has spoken about their arguments, about the tension that grew between them as her health declined, and her ability to perform at the level she had always maintained became uncertain. She wrote romantic songs during this period that she later admitted were composed at a time when something had already gone wrong between them, when the love in the lyrics was perhaps more aspiration than reality. Then came May of 2008. She was 42 years old, and she found out that her husband of 15 years had been having an affair. The woman he had been seeing was not a stranger. It was her best friend, her personal assistant, someone she had trusted completely, someone she had confided in during the hardest years of her marriage, someone who had been inside her home and her life in the most intimate way. The information came not from her husband, not from her friend, but from the friend's husband, Frederick Thibault, who had discovered the affair and felt she deserved to know. She has confirmed that this betrayal did not just break her heart. It broke something deeper. She has compared the experience to losing her parents all over again. The sudden, violent erasure of a world she thought she understood. The people she had counted on were gone, replaced by strangers who had been wearing familiar faces. She went into a grief so profound that it frightened everyone around her. She has confirmed, with a courage that left many of her fans speechless, that during this period she came to a moment on a balcony in Switzerland where she was ready to end her life. The only thing that stopped her was the thought of her young son, who was 7 years old at the time. She stepped back from that edge, and she eventually stepped back toward the world. The healing did not happen quickly. It happened slowly, painfully, with help she was not always sure she deserved to accept. She went into therapy. She began to confront not just the betrayal of 2008, but the entire accumulated weight of everything she had endured before it. The childhood abuse, the poverty, the violence, the loss of her parents, the years of performing while unwell, while frightened, while pretending that everything was fine. All of it came to the surface at once, and she had to learn how to sit with it without being destroyed by it. In one of the stranger and more beautiful turns her story took, she and Frederick, both devastated by the same act of betrayal, found their way toward each other. They began as two people who understood each other's grief in a way nobody else could. They became friends. Then they became more. On New Year's Day, 2011, they were married in a ceremony in Puerto Rico, and she has described that relationship as the one that taught her what genuine partnership actually felt like. The trust that she had lost so completely in 2008 was slowly rebuilt with a man who had also been broken and had chosen to heal. Her voice, meanwhile, was still fighting its own battle. The Lyme disease was finally diagnosed, but the damage to her vocal nerves had already been done. She was told that the condition affecting her was called dysphonia, a disruption of the nerve signals that controlled her vocal cords. There was a very real possibility that she would never sing again at the level she once had. She has spoken about grieving her voice the way a person grieves another human being, mourning its absence with a depth of sorrow that surprised even her. Singing had been her way of surviving everything. The thought of losing it felt like losing the last tool she had. But in 2018, she underwent an extraordinary surgical procedure. She was fully awake during it, lying on an operating table with surgeons working inside her throat while she sang. The procedure involved inserting supports made of a material called Gore-Tex into her vocal cords, physically stabilizing them so they could function again. She has called it one of the most frightening experiences of her life, and she has also called it one of the most liberating. When it was over, she was afraid to speak above a whisper. But gradually the sound came back. Deeper than before, different in texture and timbre, but hers. Unmistakably hers. The voice that had returned was not the same one that recorded Come On Over. It was something new. She had to relearn how to sing, rebuilding muscle memory and technique from the ground up, the way an athlete rehabilitates after serious injury. 2 full years of vocal therapy followed the surgery, and she has been transparent about how humbling and exhausting that process was. There were days when she could not hold a single note. Days when she questioned whether any of it was going.